Washington, D.C.
Tonight, Iran will pay. That message from President Trump vowing revenge after the deaths of at least 3 U.S. service members. What this means as mediators push for new ceasefire talks. We'll discuss with retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges and Congressman and Marine Corps veteran Jake Auchincloss. Also, from Maine to South Carolina, 2 major developments tonight across 2 key Senate races, including a decision from Darline, the sister of late Senator Lindsey Graham. Will she run for her brother's seat? And spoiler alert, why a federal judge is pausing the mega deal between Paramount Skydance and Warner Brothers Discovery as dozens of states sue to block the merger. Is a surprise ending in store? From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew.
And, Joe, we begin tonight with breaking news on 2 fronts, both in geopolitics and just crossing the terminal now. The U.S. is imposing a 50% tariff on many Canadian goods, including those under the USMCA trade agreement, though there will be exemptions for energy, potash, and critical minerals from that tariff that the U.S. is using Section 338 authority for, citing discriminatory actions by Canada on alcohol and dairy. That's what's happening on the trade front. On the geopolitical front, U.S. Central Command announcing a new round of strikes against Iran within the last hour. This after the president posted on True Social today, quote, "Every time Iran kills an American soldier, they will pay for that killing many times over," in the aftermath of the death of 3 more service members this weekend. And as the attacks between the U.S. and Iran ratchet up, gas prices once again are topping $4 a gallon on average nationally. For more, let's go now to the White House North Lawn, where Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan is standing by. So, Kate, this is now, I believe, the 10th day in a row of U.S. strikes on Iran. How much more could they widen and escalate, especially given the president's rhetoric?
That's right. It's right now a big open question. So, as you mentioned, just in the past hour, the U.S. has launched a new round of strikes on Iran. This is the 10th consecutive night, and it comes after 3 U.S. service members were killed over the weekend. Then, now there are reports that mediators are really pushing to try to de-escalate the war, bring talks back, and proposing a new 10-day ceasefire. But we're hearing a very different message from the president right now. As you mentioned, the president is saying that Iran will pay for every U.S. service member who is killed. And the White House then doubled down on that sentiment and said, let me just read part of the statement for you. They said the president is focused on making Iran pay for their violations of the MOU and their continued acts of terrorism in the Strait of Hormuz. Of course, the U.S. is very focused on trying to reopen the Strait of Hormuz for that critical traffic through there. In addition, the statement says the president will make Iran pay for the recent deaths of U.S. soldiers. These devastating blows will continue until the president deems otherwise, but talks between our countries are continuing. Now, that last line will bring some confusion because, as you remember, in Turkey at the NATO summit, the president basically said talks with Iran were a waste of time. He did not say that he had any faith in that diplomatic process. He said that Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, who have been leading these talks, will continue to negotiate, but it does not appear that the president has really any faith, or at least what he's saying publicly is that he does not have any faith in those talks really being fruitful. So it's very unclear where this is going to go. And again, this is now the 10th consecutive night of strikes.
Yeah. Kate, you mentioned the 3 American service members who lost their lives in the service to their country. The president is now going to be returning to Dover. According to the press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, the dignified transfer will take place tomorrow evening. This, of course, will not be his first experience going there.
That's right. So White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt did announce that the president will be attending the dignified transfer. This takes place at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. As you mentioned, Joe, this is not the first time the president has attended one of these dignified transfers since the war in Iran has begun. The death toll of U.S. service members is now up to 17. And of course, many more have been injured throughout this war.
Kate, thank you so much. With us live from the White House, Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan, and joining us now, retired General Ben Hodges, former commanding general of U.S. Army Europe. General, it's great to have you with us in person here in Washington. Welcome back to the nation's capital. With everything that we just heard, the developments over the weekend had some pretty tough headlines, some pretty tough fighting, with 3 more service members now killed and the escalation that you have seen, is the U.S. still in control of this conflict?
Well, of course, these soldiers who have been killed, each one of them has a family. Yeah. They also have teammates that will be missing them. So this is, it's a part of it, but it's painful every single time. I don't know that we are in control of this war. We haven't had a clear strategy with a clearly defined end state from the beginning. I mean, the purpose for being there has evolved from supporting the protesters to stopping Iran from producing weapons or support for Hamas and Hezbollah to now open the strait and get the oil flowing. So the absence of a strategy creates the sense that it's not under control. And, of course, we always say that the enemy gets a vote, too. And the Iranians seem to have actually increased their ability to strike certain targets.
Well, yes, we see that they are doing so, despite the president repeatedly suggesting that their military capabilities have been all but eradicated. How can both things be true at the same time?
Well, because they're not both true. The fact that our great Navy and Air Force have destroyed enormous amounts of Iranian military capability does not mean that the Iranians are without any other means. It doesn't matter how many boats have been sunk. The fact is ships captains and insurance companies are reluctant to have their tankers move through the strait. So the strait is still blocked. I think it would be helpful, candidly, if the Secretary of Defense and the White House would be more honest. Instead of reporting we've destroyed everything, the President of the United States or Secretary of Defense, be more transparent. And also, stop claiming these things. It does nothing because it's not relevant to what we think the end state is.
And it can sow quite a bit of confusion, as we've seen now for the better part of 5 months. If there are no diplomatic off-ramps, if the commander-in-chief himself says he has no faith in talks, why wait around? Why not go to all-out war until Iran either comes to the table or there's a new regime?
But all-out war to do what? Again, I hate to sound like a broken record, but that's the most important thing is to identify what are we trying to do. And in fact, you know, it would almost be worth considering, and maybe at Central Command they've already done this, step back a second instead of incrementally, okay, we're going to make you pay, we're opening up the gates of hell. Yeah. That's not strategy, okay? Instead, we understand what the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, the IRGC, has now. Yeah. We've learned a lot about Iran that maybe we didn't know beforehand. We've also learned about our own capabilities. What is the strategy now going forward? And by the way, and I agree with what Admiral Stavridis said recently, now's the time to go back to our allies and say, okay, we should have invited you guys from the beginning, but all of us have a stake in this now. So think in terms of a broader diplomatic effort, economic effort, and still, of course, building up capabilities to be prepared to achieve militarily what it is we want to achieve.
Well, I want to return to your point about the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, who is going to have to answer some of these questions tomorrow when he appears before the Senate Appropriations Committee, there to make the case for a $1.5 trillion defense budget and also for supplemental funding for the cost of this war. Do you see this, General, as being fundamentally about munitions, restoring stockpiles, and therefore ensuring our preparedness for the next fight? What happens if Pete Hegseth doesn't get the funding he's asking for?
Well, you know, I served 3 times as Army Congressional Liaison, and we knew that we had to earn the confidence of the oversight committees, the House and Senate Armed Services, the House and Senate Defense Appropriations subcommittees. So there's a lot of trust and confidence there. And it doesn't seem to me that the Pentagon has been very effective at earning the confidence. Everything is falling into partisan buckets instead of the Pentagon earning the confidence of the Congress. So, of course, the Secretary has a very, very challenging job to get the resources that they need. But they have been reluctant to go to the Congress, at this point, to get congressional support and permission. We're past the 60 days, even if the administration says, well, we've had a ceasefire, so the 60-day clock stops.
Right. Yes.
That does not build confidence and trust on the Hill.
Now that the clock appears to be ticking again, there was some remarkable reporting in the New York Times following what we saw in Jordan. over the weekend. Not one but two ballistic missiles touching down, and this is why we had, at least in part, these American casualties. The reporting would suggest that, number one, we now realize that Iran has much more ample supply of missiles than some had estimated, or at least the administration had telegraphed, and two, has become more adept at evading U.S. air defense systems. How is Iran managing this, considering the straits it's in?
Well, I think many of us may have underestimated the technical capabilities of the IRGC and Iranian military forces. I mean, they have been in the business of providing technology to Hezbollah and Houthis for quite some time now. So there is a technological capability that they have. I think that they anticipated that one day the U.S. would finally actually attack them directly, and I think maybe they were more prepared for it than I would have expected. But there's no doubt that they are a learning enemy. I also believe that I have no doubt that China and Russia are supporting them, not only with intelligence, but materially. And I think the sooner that the administration acknowledges that and then puts pressure on Moscow and Beijing, then that will help. You know, the best way to defeat Iran is to defeat Russia first. Iran has no friends other than Russia. So help Ukraine defeat Russia, and that would isolate Iran more significantly.
Well, is the sanctions package that seems like it has new momentum on Capitol Hill in the aftermath of the death of Senator Lindsey Graham, is that going to help potentially Ukraine?
It will certainly help if those sanctions are enforced. I mean, you know, putting sanctions on somebody or some country is part of it, but you have to really follow through and enforce. And there's been too many times where the administration has let the Russians off the hook, have waived things. There are some components that are made by American companies that end up in Russian missiles. How can that be? I think we are not tightening up that enough.
Amazing number today. The midterm elections are 106 days away. With gasoline now back above $4 a gallon, do you think this conflict is still underway in November?
I absolutely believe it will be. Now, it may not look like it does today.
Sure.
But the other way to ask it then is, or say it is, I don't believe it'll be solved and ships are going through the strait. And even if they did get going this week, back to normal flow, I don't think prices respond that quickly back to pre-February prices.
All right, we have to leave it there. Retired General Ben Hodges joining us here in our Washington, D.C. studio.
Thank you for the privilege.
Good to see you, sir. Thank you so much for your time. And still ahead, we'll have more on the breaking news crossing the terminal just moments ago. The U.S. set to impose a 50% tariff on many Canadian goods. We'll have the details. Also, oil swinging between gains and losses today on the threat of escalation in the Middle East that we were just discussing, even as mediators push for peace. We'll have more with Michelle Brouhard, the head of policy and geopolitical risk at Kepler, next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I am acutely conscious that I am the 6th person in the last 10 years to walk up this street, the 7th Prime Minister since 2016, making this a moment for reflection and new resolution. It requires my generation of politicians to raise our game and rise to the new challenge. Britain needs to show the world that we can regain our stability once again.
Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew. And that was the newly sworn in British Prime Minister Andy Burnham in his first remarks as PM today. One day on the job and already spooking the bond market as he talked about wanting to see any fiscal flexibility possible. And that sent gilt yields higher across the curve, but especially at the long end, up 8 basis points on the 10-year gilt, 9 on the 30-year to 574 roughly. And that saw some follow through in U.S. Treasuries today with bond yields moving higher by about 4 4 basis points across the curve, 459 where we traded on the 10-year at the end of the day. As for what was happening in equity markets, it was a mostly lower day. Interestingly, the S&P 500 was only down about 0.2% at the close, even though most stocks within the index were lower. Probably would have been a bigger down day if not for the support provided by semiconductors, which had a bit of a bounce back today with the stocks index up by about 0.6%. 2 stocks to call out in particular, though, in this edition of Power Moves: Warner Brothers Discovery and Paramount Skydance. Warner Brothers Discovery actually falling to the lowest level since December, down the better part of 4% on the day after a judge paused that merger for now. We'll see what happens at a hearing in 2 weeks on August 3rd. But the judge right now saying that that merger likely violates antitrust laws. Finally, we have to note oil as well, because it was a bit of a whipsaw session. We actually saw Brent crude rising above $91 a barrel at what point on escalating tension between the U.S. and Iran, as well as the threat from the Houthi rebels in Yemen to cut off the Red Sea to Saudi Arabia. That, of course, has been a critical alternate route since the Strait of Hormuz has been so difficult for the Saudis to get energy exports out of. Brent did come, though, off the highs of the session, as we saw reports that mediators are pushing for some kind of short-term truce between the U.S. and Iran. Still, Brent ended the day just shy of $89 a barrel. We were at roughly $83 a barrel on WTI, Joe.
All right, Kaylee. Joining us now on the major oil moves, or not so major as the case today was, that we're seeing out of the region, Michelle Brouhard, the head of policy and geopolitical risk at Kepler. It's great to have you back, Michelle. I have to admit, we woke up to the headlines of all-out war in the Middle East and a warning from Houthi rebels in Yemen that they were going to blockade Saudi Arabia. I thought we'd have a massive jump in oil prices. Brent, WTI up less than 1% each. Is the market paying attention?
The market is paying attention. The market is exhausted. I mean, aren't we all a little bit exhausted by what's happening? I think that we're starting to see, I think some people were long into the sell-off. And so as oil prices have started to come up, they've wanted to take off their positions. I haven't traded the market in a few months, so I can't be confident that that's what's happened. But I think that that was probably part of it. I think another part of it is there is still this, there were some headlines that Iran and the U.S. had reached some sort of ceasefire for 6 days. I know that's a very brief time period, but there were some rumors about that as well starting to creep into the market. And so sometimes when there's smoke, there's fire. And so we may see something that establishes some sort of ceasefire in the coming days between Iran and the U.S., or even the Houthis stand down.
Well, even if you were to get some kind of interim agreement, the last ceasefire still had plenty of fire in it, Michelle. And I wonder if you see that even if there is an interim truce, that is going to be enough to give shippers and crews enough confidence to try to transit through the Strait of Hormuz or the Red Sea, for that matter.
I think we're getting to the point now where the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea, for that matter, need to have a new framework, right? The framework of the freedom of the seas. That framework is broken, and it's going to be really hard to put that back into place. You're going to need to have a new framework that gives commercial vessels confidence to be able to pass through the either strait. And I think that's going to look like something much more structured than just military deterrence sitting in the strait trying to move ships through there. You need something that now gives the market some confidence, and that's going to take a while to form.
Does that structure include a toll booth, Michelle?
I think it does include a toll booth. I think it includes a framework that looks like a security framework. And of course, the fee is not going to be called a toll. It'll be called something like maritime security or something. It'll be rebranded into something that is a little more digestible. But I think certainly something needs to happen where these countries come together, whether it's a coalition of the Arab nations or whether it's an international framework that looks similar to the IMO, but isn't necessarily the IMO. But something needs to come about that will give some structure and a framework that will be a neutral party to allow commercial vessels to feel comfortable passing through the strait. At this point, the confidence has been eroded either in the marketplace as well as in shippers.
Well, can that come together more quickly than these exporters can find workarounds, Michelle?
I think it can come together faster than the exporters can find workaround. I don't think it can come quicker, faster than the market starts to feel the pinch or starts to become constrained. And I think I don't know if we talked about this on the last time, but the real constraint is refined products where we're not seeing refined products come out of the Middle East, but we also have Russian refined products that are constrained. So while crude oil is certainly congested in some places, it has had some real Herculean responses with Chinese imports dropping off, Saudi and the UAE being able to reroute some of their crudes in the SPR. So the crude oil prices have been able to see some sort of softness just from all three of those responses, but refined products continue to remain significantly tighter than crude.
And they have our attention as well. We've got gasoline back above $4 on average and diesel at $5.10. Michelle, with all of that said, you know, we're in the throes of hurricane season here, and it wouldn't take a lot to change the narrative around crude oil supplies or refining capacity. And another headline that we woke up to today, the SPR has a 43-day supply. Is that accurate based on your observations? And is that something investors should be worried about? It's obviously there for a crisis, but we use it in very different ways now.
I don't know what 43 days of supply means exactly versus what. Like, does that mean 43 days of supply based on net imports, 43-day supply of global shortages? Well, I don't necessarily know what the 43-day supply means. What I do know is we have drawn down 100 million barrels of the U.S. SPR. That remains that there's 70 million barrels left remaining in the commitment from the U.S. into the IEA SPR release that came out with the 400 million barrels. So we still have, and if we're releasing 1 million barrels a day, that's 70 days of SPR that can still come into the marketplace. I don't know if that 43 days is after, and how many is that a release of 1 million barrels a day or a release of, I don't, there needs to be significantly more detail around 43 days. It sounds dramatic, but it's probably, the SPR has lots of problems, right? Structurally, it has lots of problems. You can't draw it down to zero. But I think that the U.S. will meet their commitment of 172 million barrels. And so we have 70 million barrels left that can be released.
Well, so as we consider the global energy picture, we just saw headlines at the top of the hour, Michelle, that the U.S. is getting ready to impose a 50% tariff on Canadian products in 30 days, though there are exceptions, including for energy imports. How crucial is that, given the precarious energy situation the U.S. and the rest of the world find itself in?
Well, it's really concerning, Kayleigh. One of the reasons that it's concerning to me as an American is that the U.S. is energy independent because of Canada, right? Canada is basically held hostage by the United States. They only really have one outlet, which means that the Canadians need to start building infrastructure away from the United States. So antagonizing Canada, who has been our largest supplier and has really been the reason why the U.S. has been able to have cheap energy prices for decades, is because of Canada. And if Canada decides that they want to reroute their oil to Asia or to Europe, if they want to build a pipeline across to the east, then you're really running into the fact that Canada is going to have a much more diversified energy economy than they currently have now, which really they have a small outlet to the West Coast that is maybe, let's call it 1 million barrels a day and be generous, but most of their oil still comes to the United States. In addition to that, we also receive our border is integrated with electricity, natural gas, oil, refined products, and they have the option to perhaps use that as a weapon if they chose to.
All right, we'll leave it there. Michelle Brouhard, thanks so much for joining us. And we'll have more still ahead here on Balance of Power as we speak with Democratic Congressman Jake Auchincloss of Massachusetts next on Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kayleigh Lyons. Up on Capitol Hill, House lawmakers have just 4 legislative days to tackle a long list of items before breaking for the August recess, including a continuing resolution to fund the government until early December, a must-pass defense authorization bill, and a budget resolution for Reconciliation 3.0 that includes tens of billions of dollars for the Pentagon related to the war with Iran, which is ongoing tonight, with President Trump threatening retribution against Iran following the deaths of 3 service members this weekend after a series of back-and-forth strikes between the U.S. and Iran, bringing the total number of American service members killed since the start of the war to 17. And joining us now for more is Democratic Congressman Jake Auchincloss of Massachusetts, who serves on the House Energy and Commerce Committee and is a combat Marine Corps veteran, having served in Afghanistan. Congressman, welcome back to Bloomberg. When you consider this death toll that now stands at 17 and what is now a 10th round of strikes that the U.S. is conducting against Iran in retaliation for that and attacks against commercial shipping, is the only way out of this further escalation?
No. The way out of this is for Congress to do its constitutional job and prevent this president from waging an illegal war. But Speaker Mike Johnson, Senate Majority Leader John Thune, they're too weak, they're too afraid to do that job, which is why these midterms matter so much. American soldiers are dead because this president has failed to learn the lessons of history and has dragged this country into yet another debacle in the Middle East.
The president, of course, has had a lot to say over the past couple of days, Congressman, and you have always told us not to listen to what Donald Trump says, but to watch what he does. And if that is the case, then we are closer to all-out war now than we were, say, a week ago. I'm wondering your thoughts on that, what you're hearing, and where we might be in another week. We have had very mixed messages on this. Are we headed back to all-out war with Iran? And if that is the case, will there be an answer from Democrats?
The president has already lost this war. I think we need to be clear about that. He's the first president in American history to start and lose a war by himself. And he lost this kinetic war against Iran for the same reason that he lost the trade war against China last year, which is that he does not understand the nature of choke point control. With China, it was able to exercise choke point control over critical minerals, and so he had to back down from his trade war. With Iran, even though our military is operationally excellent and is able to degrade Iran's infrastructure and military capabilities, Iran was able to exercise choke point control over the Strait of Hormuz. Now, this was drawn up in American war plans for decades, but the president ignored it and allowed the new Ayatollah to cinch the transit of oil and other critical commodities for the global economy. And so the president has lost. He's yielded a new strategic deterrent now to a more hardline and hardened regime. And the question is, do more American soldiers need to die before he realizes that he needs to prevent a further escalation rather than double down on it?
So you see no prospect, Congressman, of there being any kind of victory for the United States? This is not salvageable in your mind?
My view is history shows that sunk cost bias and groupthink are two very dangerous elements. The reason the United States fought a war in Afghanistan for a full 10 years longer than it should have is not because individuals in Washington, D.C. didn't know it was a bad idea. They definitely did. It's because of sunk cost bias, this concept of, well, we already spent $1 trillion and we already lost these service members, so we got to keep going, and groupthink. If everyone sits in a room and nobody wants to be the one who says, hey, this ain't working. My job as a member of Congress is to prevent sunk cost bias and groupthink from costing more American lives and from leading this country further down the sinkhole of despair and debacle that has become this Iran war. And what Congress needs to do is it needs to prevent this president from further acting in regards to military actions in the Middle East. And it needs to try to get to some kind of a status quo agreement on transit through the Strait of Hormuz, and then prevent any kind of agreements or diplomacy that could take us backwards in the short term, because this president just clearly can't handle it.
We spoke with retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges earlier this hour, who happens to be in town right now, Congressman, and we have always noted your service as a Marine Corps combat veteran and the time that you spent in Afghanistan, not to mention in Panama. With that said, the Secretary of Defense is headed to Capitol Hill tomorrow. He's going to be testifying alongside the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. What questions, if you put your old hat back on as a Marine, would you be asking them to justify the budget request that's being made?
What is the actual state of American munitions preparedness? What are the total number of troops who have been injured, not just killed, in action? What was the war planning around the decision to launch hostilities in February, and why didn't it include the Ayatollah's clear and predictable reaction of trying to close down the Strait of Hormuz? what are the congressional authorities that you think you are acting on right now, as a war that the president said was going to last a couple weeks is now lasting months without any congressional approval. I mean, the list goes on, and ultimately I hope that the Secretary of Defense will be answering them during impeachment proceedings when Democrats take back the House.
Well, when you ask the question on munitions in particular, if he is able to give an answer around our military's munition stockpiles and therefore our readiness, and says that there is justifiable need for supplemental funding to replenish those, would you find yourself willing to support the budget resolution that provides more money to the Pentagon?
I'm not sending more money to the Pentagon or to this administration without very significant riders that prevent their ability to wage this war in Iran, that clamp down on the corruption and self-dealing of this administration. That it's an unacceptable ask from an administration that has been too hubristic to consult Congress or allies about launching this war, to then come back and say, hey, you still don't get any authority over approving it, but we need money to wage it. No.
You've said that the president has lost this war, Congressman, and therefore the U.S. Would have lost this war. What then? Should we pack up our toys and leave? What do you do with this massive armada that's been assembled in the Middle East?
Yeah, my view, as I've said previously, is you've got to try to cobble together as much as possible a status quo antebellum in which transit through the Strait of Hormuz is achievable. It'll be more expensive because of insurance premiums and because of the transit time it'll take ships to avoid probably the near shore. But some kind of a status quo where that becomes at least tenable. And then you need to accept a degraded holding pattern until there's a new president, because this president cannot be trusted with war and peace in the Middle East. He has led us into this catastrophe, and he will not take us out. He's not capable or competent to it.
Well, while it may have been the president's ultimate decision, we know that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu also played a role in this. And Congressman, you, of course, joined with more than 100 of your colleagues to vote to strip some funding away from Israel last week, some $3 billion worth. There was a suggestion by the New York City Mayor, Zohar Mamdani, recently that when Benjamin Netanyahu comes to New York for the UN General Assembly in September, that he may be arrested. President Trump says under no uncertain terms that will not be happening. Should it?
No. Arresting heads of government or heads of state at a United Nations General Assembly is not an acceptable action, nor is it within the remit of a mayor. That I don't support. What I do support is that there needs to be consequences for bad decision making. Israel absolutely has a right to defend itself against the terrorists to its southern and northern flanks, as well as the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism, which is the Islamic Republic of Iran. But buying F-35s on a U.S. credit card, which is what foreign military financing is, that's not a right. That is a privilege granted by Congress on a yearly basis. And Trump and Netanyahu together have violated the trust upon which that right is based. And it needs to be removed. The credit card needs to be taken away until better decisions between these two heads of government can be made.
There could be a vote as soon as this evening, we understand, Congressman, to fund the government beyond the September 30 deadline and, in fact, beyond Election Day. Will that continuing resolution, whether it's tonight or tomorrow, pass?
That's a question for Speaker Mike Johnson.
Are you a no?
I'm not going to support legislation to fund an administration that holds itself lawless and above any oversight from Congress. If they want money from Congress, which has the power of the purse, they need to submit to oversight and accountability from Congress, and they need to demonstrate that they will follow the laws passed by Congress.
Well, Congressman, it's good to have you with us to get through this. Jake Auchincloss, the Democrat from Massachusetts. Apparently, we've got a lot of things to figure out still, Congressman, and we'd like to keep talking with you about them. Thanks for being back with us today on Bloomberg.
Likewise.
It's a Senate race considered crucial to Democrats' push to take back the Senate next year. We're talking about Maine. Coming up next, the new candidate on track to replace Graham Plattner, and a big decision tonight out of South Carolina. It's all coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Kaylee Lyons. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Looks like former Maine state lawmaker Troy Jackson could be the one. Democrats' next best chance to take on Senator Susan Collins in the fall. Things happen quickly, with Jackson now suddenly emerging as the lead candidate for the nomination following a series of county nominating meetings in Maine this weekend. Will he be a strong enough candidate for Democrats to defeat the longtime Senator Collins this fall? And how vetted is he, given what the party just saw happen to their former nominee, Graham Plattner? We know who to ask. Bloomberg's Nancy Cook has been all over this and has traveled to Maine repeatedly and doing a great job talking about this. We're going to ask you about South Carolina as well. But how did this happen so quickly? He's essentially cleared the field for himself.
Yeah, it's remarkable. I talked with a bunch of Maine people this morning, and really, I think even they were surprised by it. Yeah. And, they know him. He's been a state senator. Mm-hmm. Really, I was told that what he did is, he's a logger by trade. And so he really has the support of the labor unions. And so had a bunch of the different labor parties, the Electrical Workers Union, the Nurses Union, the AFL-CIO, a labor climate group in Maine, calling a bunch of people. And he got, they reached out to about 20,000 people in a very short period of time over the weekend and basically managed to coalesce a bunch of support. So much so that CNN just canceled the debate that they're supposed to have in Maine on Thursday night because all the opponents dropped out. I just thought it was such an interesting moment because there is this image of Democrats as a party in disarray right now. Yeah. And I think the party is still, looking for its dominant ideology or its party leader. But in Maine, here's this guy, Troy Jackson, that was able to very efficiently get local support.
Yeah, an interesting guy. He was a Republican at one point. Now he's a progressive. Is he the kind of man Susan Collins is comfortable running against?
I don't know. It remains to be seen. So he ran for governor this year and came in third in a ranked choice election. He has cast himself as a progressive, sort of in the mold of Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren. But, he's not someone who's totally easy to pin down. He didn't become a Democrat till 2004, as you said. And so I think, it's going to be hard for Collins to just totally paint him as a socialist, because I think he has a more nuanced record. And, I talked to some of his supporters today who said, we're tired of Collins. We don't feel like she's done a lot for the state under Trump. And here's a guy who's talking about economic policy in a new way.
What's the Oppo research department doing here after Graham Plattner? I'm sure Republicans are looking, and Democrats are a little fearful about what they've.
I talked to some Republicans today. I think that they are, building the opposition file right now. Yeah. I think what they want to do is they want Democrats to settle on him, which they're going to do this Saturday officially at a convention.
That's right.
And then they're going to roll out the opposition. I mean, Plattner, though, you have to remember, never ran or won state office before. And so Troy Jackson, will figure out what the skeletons are in his closet. Mm-hmm. But he was a state senator. He ran for governor. Do you know what I mean? He has been out there in a way that Graham Plattner was not.
Well, someone else who hasn't run a traditional campaign but now finds themselves in the U.S. Senate is Darline Graham, of course, now Senator of South Carolina after the passing of her brother, Lindsey Graham. She now says she's going to run to fill that seat permanently. President Trump has endorsed her. There are other people, though, in this race for this very quick primary happening on August 11th. Could she clear the field, too?
I think that she could. I mean, I've been to Texas and Kentucky where, Trump-backed candidates really cleared the field in, surprising ways. So I wouldn't discount it. I think that his endorsement could go a long way, particularly in a state like South Carolina, where he's very popular. Mm-hmm.
If you're Ralph Norman right now, you're thinking hard about your chances. She made this reference in an interview on Fox News that's going to air later. I'm in, she said. I've been praying a lot, talking to my family. I feel like I can do it. What kind of campaign would this be?
I mean, I think, she's a new politician. I do think, though, that with these Trump-backed candidates, there's a lot of money that goes along with that. So the Senate Leadership Fund has a bunch of money. MAGA Inc., Trump's primary political outside group, has a lot of money. They haven't spent it yet, but there's a lot of money floating around in Republican circles that they tend to direct towards Trump-backed candidates. So she could have access to a lot of, consultants that are aligned with the Trump team and money, if it works out for her.
A couple of big developments on some key races. Nancy, thank you. Bloomberg's Nancy Cook with us live in Washington as we assemble our political panel now. Bloomberg politics contributors Jeannie Shanzano, our Democratic strategist and democracy visiting fellow at Harvard, the Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center, alongside Republican strategist Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital. Great to have you on our Monday edition here. Rick, I'll start with you as we stick with this Senate race in South Carolina, because I know that this is personal for you. Not only did you work with Lindsey Graham for many, many years, but you know his sister, Darline. Many Americans have just been introduced to her. How do you run someone for the United States Senate who's never done this before?
Yeah, well, she's got the right last name, so that'll help a lot. I guess middle name, but she will need to introduce herself to the public, right? Nobody gets a bye these days, and so that'll be the biggest hurdle, right? Is who is she? What does she stand for? How does she relate to the voters? What kind of candidate is she? So that's one hurdle for her, and then of course, she will not get much of a break with Democrats coming after her, right? I agree with Nancy. I think the field will clear for her.
You do?
And she will have an enormous amount of resources, sure, because it's the president, the governor, the vice president. I mean, like the most of the statewide elected office holders will all endorse this concept. So they'll all have to pull together to help her on the positive side, but they'll also have to defend her because the Democrats will use this as an opportunity to say, maybe we could put this seat in play. Before with Graham they couldn't. Maybe with Darline they can, and they'll come at her, I'm sure, with both barrels.
Well, would that be a smart use of resources, Jeannie, in a deep red state like South Carolina?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're going to use some of their resources. And as Rick said, Democrats never imagined that they would have an inkling of a shot there. Now that they may have a first-time candidate who, of course, is going to have a lot of support, certainly name recognition, a cleared field, as Rick said, and I'm sure she'll get on the Republican side, they still may put some resources. They have a really interesting candidate in Dr. Andrews, and she, of course, has never run for office herself. She is really an interesting outsider type of candidate, but I don't think they're going to feel they really have a shot unless, for some reason, we see the Republican candidate have some big challenges on the stump. It's hard to imagine she will. It's hard to imagine they're going to get a lot of opposition research on her. But if something happens, they want to have resources there so they could start to try to fill that gap.
You wonder what kind of resources are going to be heading for Maine now, Rick. Troy Jackson, how are you watching this as a Republican? Should Susan Collins be pleased by the apparent disarray or concerned that Democrats actually crystallized around a nominee pretty quickly here, assuming this is a deal that's closed?
Well, the self-destruction of Plattner was a big gift for her because he certainly had something going on there that was a threat to her election. But really, I think her view of the race is more about her, right? She's got pressure with Republicans who think she doesn't do enough for Trump, and then she has pressure from other voters who think she does too much for Trump. And then on top of all that, she's an incumbent. And those three things are a hard thing to overcome. So if she keeps focused and deals with the voters that she has to square with on those three, the trilogy of her reelection, she'll be fine. But at the end of the day, Democrats have a chance to restart this race, albeit late, with few resources. And I think anybody who looks at this race objectively, what was swinging away from Susan Collins, 2 months ago, is swinging back hard her way now.
Well, she, of course, is the chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, Jeannie, which means she will be the one running the hearing tomorrow in which the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth will be testifying along with the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Kane. And I wonder if you think that may be an opportunity for her to present herself breaking with the president over the war with Iran?
It absolutely would be an opportunity for her to do that. But as we've seen with Susan Collins, at least according to most Mainers, she has not done that enough or sufficiently. And for all her prowess and running in Maine and winning, and she has proven unbeatable, she has never had to run in an environment like this. She's never had to run after she supported the man for the Supreme Court who overturned Roe v. Wade. She has never had to run when ICE is on the street and she's given them billions of dollars for the promise that they will have cameras, and they have not had them, and they are killing Americans and people on the streets of this country. She's never had to run when we are in a very unpopular war. She's sitting there as the chair of appropriations, and she's going to be facing Pete Hegseth, who's asking for $1.5 trillion, or the White House is. So she could separate herself, but I'm not so sure she is going to be able to do that. And so I think what Troy Jackson has been able to do in rounding up these delegates has been very impressive so far, and he has shown that he can get the Democrats in Maine at least behind him, and I think it's going to be a formidable race for Susan Collins, maybe for the first time since she's been in office.
You know, she might find a place to split with the president when it comes to tariffs as well, specifically to that country over the border from Maine. Rick Davis, a 50% tariff on some Canadian goods using a never-before-used legal provision, citing what it said was unfair treatment by Ottawa of American alcohol. This isn't even about the wildfires, apparently. This is, again, supposed to be the purview of Congress. Could a Susan Collins make some hay out of this to her benefit?
Sure. I definitely think there'll be some kind of sister soldier moment where she will depart from Trump. I mean, there's very much, I'm probably too old.
No, I'm with you.
And the reality is she just needs to be able to show that independence, right? Sure. And I don't think she'll even blink about the need to do that. I think that's baked into the equation. I'm sure the campaign has spent a lot of time trying to find the perfect issue to do that. And, you know, being able to go to the defense of American alcohol and at the same time push back on bad tariffs may be exactly where she needs to go.
Bill Clinton just winced somewhere when Rick said that. I love it.
Well, Jeannie, just when we think that the tariff story might be dying down, we get fresh ones, even ones I would note that include goods that are covered under the USMCA agreement.
Yeah, that's right. And, you know, I love Rick's reference to the sister soldier moment. I do remember that. The problem is that while that may be a good start for Susan Collins to differentiate herself, it's not going to be nearly enough for the people of Maine. She has served there a long time. It is a tough year for her to run. I don't care how much she tries to take on Trump tariffing alcohol or anything else. It's not going to be enough to assuage them that they can trust her, because when she's not running for election, she has not taken on Trump. In fact, she has helped him along the way to do what he's done, and what he's done has been very unpopular in Maine and across the rest of the country.
All right, Jeannie Sheehan Zaino and Rick Davis, our political panel this evening. Thank you both so much for joining us. And make sure to tune in to Balance of Power tomorrow. We'll be going to Capitol Hill and speaking with Republican Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, as well as Democratic Senator Mark Warner. Looking forward to those conversations.
Yeah, we're coming back up, boys and girls, tomorrow live from the Senate. In the meantime, check out the Washington Edition newsletter. You can find it on the terminal and online.
And we'll see you tomorrow for Balance of Power right here on Bloomberg TV and Radio.